My brother locked me out of our company servers at 2 in the morning. A text illuminated my dark bedroom. "The company is mine now. Security will pack your desk." I did not argue. I walked into the lobby at dawn, let his wife humiliate me in front of 50 employees, and watched the guards throw my box onto the pavement. They thought they stole a multi-million-dollar tech startup. They did not know I owned the underlying patents. Evicting me just triggered a $5 million penalty. The fatal error message flashed across my monitors at 2 in the morning. Access denied. I sat in my home office staring at the screen. For 3 years, I sacrificed sleep, weekends, and relationships to write the predictive logistics algorithms that served as the backbone of our startup. I hit refresh. The server rejected my credentials again. My phone vibrated against the desk. It was a message from Julian, my older brother, and our head of sales. "The board voted tonight. You are out. The company is mine now. Security will pack your desk. Do not make a scene." I did not reply. I grabbed my coat and drove straight to our downtown Seattle headquarters. The morning rain washed the streets in a dull gray. When I reached the lobby, my keycard glowed red at the turnstile. The glass doors remained locked. Beyond them, 50 employees stopped typing. They stared at me. Naomi strode into the lobby. She is Julian's wife, a sharp African-American public relations executive who uses her designer suits as armor and her words as weapons. She despised my working-class habits. She hated that a data analyst held half the equity in her husband's venture. Naomi snapped her fingers at the 2 security guards flanking her. "Take her box outside," Naomi ordered. Her voice echoed off the marble walls, designed to carry, designed to humiliate. She turned to me, offering a venomous smile. "You are just a code monkey, Vivian. Julian is the brains. He secured the venture capital. We do not need a glorified typist dragging down our valuation. Get off my property before I call the police." The guards bypassed the turnstile. They carried a flimsy cardboard box. One of them tipped it forward, dropping it directly onto the wet pavement outside the sliding doors. My coffee mug shattered against the concrete. Printed financial models spilled into the gutters, soaking up the dirty rain. I stood on the sidewalk. The cold water seeped into my wool coat. Julian stepped out from an elevator in the background. He stood behind Naomi, his arms crossed, nodding his approval. He needed my technical skills to build the product. Now that the product was ready for a $50 million buyout, he discarded me like liability paperwork. He wanted all the glory and all the equity. I looked down at the broken ceramic shards at my feet. I did not yell. I did not pound my fists against the glass. I checked my wristwatch. It was 8 in the morning. Julian and Naomi spent their days courting investors and polishing pitch decks. They obsessed over optics. They never bothered to read the actual corporate and corporation filings. Julian thought he just executed a flawless hostile takeover. He actually stole an empty shell. My name is Vivian. I am 31 years old, and I analyze forensic financial data for a living. Before I tell you how I bankrupted my own brother using a single line of intellectual property code, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you know the quietest person in the room is always the most dangerous. 3 years ago, I registered the core algorithm under a separate holding company. I am the sole owner of that holding company. The startup Julian just stole only licensed the software. By terminating my employment without formal consensus and barring me from the premises, Julian triggered a breach of contract. I no longer worked for the startup. But the startup now owed me an immediate penalty fee of $5 million. I picked up my ruined files, turned my back on the glass doors, and walked to my car. It was time to draft an invoice. The rain battered the windows of my townhouse, washing away the remnants of the morning. I parked my sedan in the driveway, unlocked the front door, and discarded my damp wool coat. I bypassed the kitchen and walked straight into my home office. A forensic data analyst never relies on a single point of failure. I booted up my secondary encrypted laptop. I knew Julian would lock my primary corporate email account. I also knew he would dispatch his legal attack dog within the hour to ensure my silence. I sat in my ergonomic chair and waited. I did not have to wait long. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, my personal cellular phone began to ring. The caller identification display showed the main directory number for a prominent downtown litigation firm. I pressed the green accept icon and activated the speakerphone function. I placed the device flat on my glass desk, folding my hands in my lap. "Vivian, this is Harrison." The voice on the other end of the line belonged to a senior partner renowned for his ruthless corporate tactics. He spoke with the slow, condescending rhythm of a man who dismantles small startups for sport. His tone was coated in practiced artificial pity. "I understand this morning was difficult for you. Julian asked me to reach out and finalize the separation paperwork. We want to handle this transition as cleanly as possible." I did not offer a greeting. I allowed his words to echo in the quiet room. Harrison took my silence as an invitation to dictate his terms. "The board of directors held an emergency session last night, Vivian. They formally ratified your termination. Julian is the acting chief executive officer. He has sole discretionary power over the corporate assets. Now my client is prepared to be generous. He acknowledges your early contributions to the coding process. We are offering you a severance package of $50,000 in exchange for a full waiver of your equity shares and a signed non-disclosure agreement." He paused, letting the lowball offer hang in the air. When I still did not respond, Harrison shifted his tactic from false pity to overt intimidation. "If you refuse to sign the waiver, my firm will tie you up in litigation for the next decade." Harrison warned, his voice hardening into a direct threat. "We will bury you in discovery motions. We will drain your personal savings with legal fees. We will paint a public narrative that you were an erratic, disgruntled employee who endangered the company structure. Take the $50,000, Vivian. Walk away before we ruin your future employment prospects." I listened to the steady sound of his breathing through the speakerphone. I listened to the faint rustle of legal documents shifting on his desk. He was waiting for me to cry. He was waiting for me to scream about the injustice of my brother stealing 3 years of my labor. "Are you finished, Harrison?" I asked. My voice carried the chilling flat resonance of a machine reading binary code. Harrison scoffed. "I am offering you a lifeline. I suggest you take it." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the glass desk. "Open your state business registry database, Harrison," I instructed. "Type in the entity search bar. Look up filing number 88429. I heard a momentary pause on the line. Harrison was a high-priced litigator. He did not take orders from evicted employees, but the sheer unyielding certainty in my voice made him hesitate. I heard the rapid clicking of a mechanical keyboard. I was typing the numbers into his terminal. "That is a separate holding firm." Harrison noted his tone dismissive, but laced with a sudden creeping curiosity. "Registered 3 years ago. What does this have to do with Julian's startup?" "Scroll down to the Intellectual Property Assignments Counselor," I replied. "Read the ownership deed for the predictive logistics algorithm." The clicking resumed. Then it stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was profound. It was not the confident silence of a lawyer plotting his next argument. It was the breathless, suffocating silence of a man realizing he had just stepped onto a landmine. I could picture the color draining from his face as his eyes scanned the digital registry. "Ma'am," Harrison whispered. The arrogance had entirely evaporated from his vocabulary, replaced by a raw, vibrating panic. "What did you do with the intellectual property filings I built the architecture of my own survival, Harrison?" I stated, spelling out the trap with surgical precision. "I know my brother. Julian possesses immense charisma and zero technical ability. I knew the moment the software became profitable, he would attempt to push me out and claim the venture capital for himself. Therefore, before we ever incorporated his startup, I established that private holding firm. I am the sole managing director and sole shareholder of that entity. I registered the patents, the source code, and the proprietary algorithms under my holding firm. Julian's startup never owned the technology." Harrison let out a sharp, ragged exhale. "They leased it," he muttered, the terrifying reality setting in. "Exactly, I confirmed. Julian's company merely signed a software licensing agreement with my holding firm. And if you review Section 4, Paragraph B of that master agreement, you will find a very specific penalty clause. If the holding firm's managing director is terminated from the licensee company without a unanimous documented shareholder vote that includes her own signature, the licensing agreement defaults immediately." I let the legal trap snap shut around his neck. By using Naomi's security guards to throw my personal effects onto the pavement this morning, Julian did not steal a tech empire. He breached a commercial contract. Julian's startup is now an empty hollow shell. He is currently pitching venture capitalists to invest $50 million into a company that owns zero technology. The sound of Harrison swallowing hard echoed through the speaker. The lawyer realized his client was not a visionary chief executive. His client was an idiot who had just committed catastrophic corporate sabotage. The breach of contract triggers an immediate penalty fee. I continued tightening the noose. Julian's company currently owes my holding firm $5 million for licensing violations. You cannot enforce that. Harrison stammered, his legal composure falling apart. That penalty is exorbitant. A judge will toss it out. I drafted the contract utilizing the very same legal precedents your firm uses to bankrupt small vendors, Harrison. It is ironclad. I replied, my voice dropping to a freezing whisper. You have 48 hours to wire the $5 million into my holding firm's account. If the funds do not clear, I will revoke the server access keys. I will shut down the entire logistics network. Your clients' clients will lose their routing data. The venture capitalists will pull their funding, and Julian will face federal fraud charges for soliciting investments without disclosing a revoked software license. Harrison could not formulate a counter-argument. The threat of litigation meant nothing when I held the operational switch to the entire business. Draft the invoice, counselor, I commanded. Have a productive morning. I reached out and pressed the red button terminating the call. The room fell silent again. I looked at my computer screen, watching the server traffic monitor. Harrison would panic. He would call Julian. But I knew my brother's ego. Julian would never accept defeat over a phone call. His narcissism would demand a public confrontation. He would rally his allies. He would summon the shareholders to a boardroom, desperate to use mob mentality to force my surrender. He thought he could bully me in person. I welcomed the invitation. The predictable cadence of an arrogant mind is its greatest vulnerability. Harrison's panicked phone call did not induce caution in Julian. It provoked an erratic, explosive rage. A narcissist confronted with his own catastrophic error will never accept responsibility. He will immediately attempt to rally a crowd to validate his delusion and crush the messenger. Within 3 hours of disconnecting from Harrison, I received an automated calendar alert. An emergency mandatory shareholder meeting had been scheduled in the executive boardroom at our downtown headquarters. Julian was summoning his court. I changed into a tailored charcoal suit. I did not hurry. I allowed the meeting to begin without me. I wanted Julian to expend his energy painting me as the villain before I dismantled his narrative. I arrived at the headquarters at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The lobby security guards, the same men who had dumped my belongings into the rain that morning, shifted uncomfortably as I approached the glass doors. I did not speak to them. I raised my phone, displaying a digital access code generated directly from my master server control panel. The turnstile clicked open. I walked past the bewildered guards stepping into the elevator. The executive boardroom occupied the top floor, encased in floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a panoramic view of the Seattle skyline. I paused outside the heavy oak doors, listening to the muffled voices carrying through the wood. Julian was holding court. His voice, usually slick and charismatic when pitching investors, was now loud, defensive, and desperate. "We cannot allow a disgruntled, low-level coder to hold this company hostage," Julian bellowed. His words were punctuated by the aggressive slap of his palm against the mahogany table. "Vivian is unstable. Her actions threaten the $50 million venture capital acquisition. She is attempting to extort us." Naomi's sharp, abrasive voice chimed in immediately, providing the necessary public relations spin. "She is a saboteur." Naomi declared, pacing near the presentation screen. "We treated her like family, and she repays us with corporate terrorism. We must vote to initiate a full civil lawsuit against her personally to reclaim our intellectual property." The murmurs of agreement from the minority shareholders drifted through the door. They were frightened investors easily manipulated by Julian's loud confidence and Naomi's aggressive posturing. They were nodding along, agreeing to destroy the woman who had actually built the product they were attempting to sell. I placed my hand on the brass handle. I did not knock. I pushed the heavy doors open, stepping into the room. The boardroom fell into a sudden, shocked silence. 12 heads turned to face me. Julian froze at the head of the table, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. Naomi stopped pacing, crossing her arms tightly over her designer blouse, her eyes narrowing into hostile slits. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face here, Vivian," Julian hissed, recovering his bravado for the audience. "Security removed your access. You are trespassing. Get out before I have you arrested." I did not respond to his threat. I did not look at the hostile shareholders who had just agreed to ruin me. I walked straight toward the center of the long mahogany table. My posture was rigid, my expression a mask of absolute unfeeling stone. I carried a single thick manila folder. I stopped directly across from Julian. I reached into the folder. I extracted a stack of heavy premium-grade paper. A bright, glaring red border framed the top document. I did not hand the papers to him politely. I tossed them, letting the stack land with a sharp, heavy slap directly in the center of the polished wood, right where everyone could see the bold black text printed across the header. "I am not here to negotiate, Julian," I stated, my voice echoing clear and cold across the silent room. "And I am not trespassing. I am a vendor delivering a past-due invoice." The minority shareholders stared at the red document. Julian stared at it. "That is an official demand for payment from my holding firm." I continued, ensuring my enunciation was flawless. "Your startup breached the software licensing agreement at 8 o'clock this morning. As managing director of the entity that owns the predictive logistics algorithm, I am executing the penalty clause." I leaned forward slightly, resting my knuckles on the table, fixing Julian with a predatory stare. "You have exactly 48 hours to wire $5 million into my holding firm's account," I declared. "If the funds do not clear by 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon, I will revoke your server access keys. I will shut down the entire logistics network. Your clients will lose their routing data instantly." The room gasped. One of the older shareholders, a man who had invested his retirement savings into Julian's pitch, turned pale. "You cannot do that," the investor stammered, looking frantically between Julian and me. "That will trigger massive breach of contract lawsuits from our clients. It will destroy the company. It is already destroyed." I replied, not breaking eye contact with Julian. "You invested in a man who sold you a house he did not own. If the invoice is not paid, I pull the plug. The venture capitalists will walk away, and you will all be holding shares in a worthless, empty shell." Julian's facade of arrogant control shattered completely. The realization that he had trapped himself, that his attempt to steal my work had just handed me the weapon to execute him financially, broke his fragile ego. The veneer of the slick chief executive vanished, replaced by the raw, violent rage of an exposed fraud. "You scheming little bitch!" Julian roared, his voice cracking with fury. He lunged across the mahogany table. He knocked over a carafe of water, sending a glass shattering against the floor. He lunged straight for my throat, his hands curling into vicious claws intent on physically silencing the threat he could not outsmart. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood perfectly still, watching him lose control. Before Julian's fingers could graze my collar, the 2 security guards stationed near the doorway reacted. They were not loyal to Julian. They were loyal to the building management protocols. They rushed forward, grabbing Julian by his suit jacket and hauling him backward. They dragged him away from the table, pinning his arms to his sides. "Let me go!" Julian screamed, thrashing wildly against the guards. "I will kill you, Vivian. I swear I will ruin you." I looked at the man struggling against the security detail. His tie was skewed, his face purple with rage. The confident brother who had mocked me via text message at 2 a.m. was gone, replaced by a pathetic, violent spectacle. The shareholders watched him in horrified silence. They finally saw the reality of the man they had trusted with their money. I picked up the empty manila folder from the table. I turned my back on Julian screaming. I looked at the stunned shareholders. 48 hours, gentlemen," I said softly. "I suggest you contact your banks." I walked out of the boardroom, the sound of my brother's unhinged fury echoing behind me, sealing his own destruction in front of his investors. The financial guillotine was primed. I only needed to wait for the blade to drop. I stepped out of the executive boardroom, leaving the frantic shouting of the shareholders and the struggling form of my brother behind the heavy oak doors. The corridor was silent, the thick carpeting absorbing the sharp click of my heels. I had delivered the invoice. I had initiated the countdown. I believed the ambush was perfectly executed. I believed they had no countermeasure. A forensic analyst must always account for hidden variables. I had not accounted for the sheer depth of their criminality. Before I could reach the elevator bank, the boardroom doors slammed open behind me. Naomi strode out into the hallway. She did not run. She moved with the predatory, measured grace of an apex predator closing in on a wounded target. Her designer heels snapped against the hardwood floor surrounding the elevator bank. She bypassed her struggling husband. She bypassed the panicked investors. She was focused entirely on me. Vivian. Naomi's voice was a sharp, commanding crack, halting me mid-stride. I turned around slowly, my hand resting on the elevator call button. Naomi closed the distance between us, stopping just outside my personal space. The arrogant sneer had returned to her face, replacing the momentary shock she had displayed in the boardroom. She did not look like a woman facing a $5 million penalty. She looked like a woman holding a royal flush. She reached into the sleek leather portfolio tucked under her arm. She extracted a single sheet of heavy stock paper. She did not toss it. She held it up, pinching the top corners, delicately displaying the document right in front of my face. "You think you are so clever playing with your little holding companies and your secret patents?" Naomi mocked, her voice laced with a condescending, venomous sweetness. "You forgot one minor detail, sweetie. You already gave the company the rights to the software." I looked at the document. It was a formal intellectual property transfer agreement. The text outlined the complete, unconditional, and uncompensated transfer of all patents, source code, and algorithms from my holding firm directly to Julian's startup. My eyes dropped to the bottom of the page. There, resting on the signature line, was my name. It was executed in blue ink. It was dated exactly 4 weeks ago, right before Julian began intense negotiations with the venture capital firm. The air in the hallway seemed to solidify, pressing against my chest. The breath caught in my throat. For a fraction of a second, a cold spike of panic paralyzed my mind. They possessed a signed transfer agreement. The $5 million penalty was void. My leverage was entirely neutralized. They had legally stolen my life's work. Naomi saw the subtle shift in my posture. She recognized the momentary hesitation and she pounced on it. She stepped closer, invading my space, leaning in so close I could smell the sharp metallic tang of her expensive perfume. "I run public relations for a living, little girl," Naomi hissed, dropping the sweet facade. Her voice dropped to a lethal, vibrating whisper meant only for my ears. "I destroy reputations before breakfast. If you try to challenge this document, if you dare to file a lawsuit and delay our venture capital funding, I will bury you." She leaned closer, her dark eyes locking onto mine with absolute malice. "I will leak a curated file of your erratic behavior to every media outlet in the tech sector," Naomi threatened. "I will hire behavioral psychologists to analyze your isolation and your paranoia. I will craft a narrative so compelling, so meticulously documented, that society will believe you suffered a complete psychotic break. You will not see the inside of a courtroom, Vivian. You will see the inside of a psychiatric ward. Do not test me. I will lock you away and throw away the key." Naomi stepped back, her face smoothing back into a mask of aristocratic superiority. She believed she had just delivered the kill shot. She believed the threat of institutionalization would break my spirit and force my surrender. She expected me to crumble. She expected me to scream about the injustice, or perhaps weep in despair as my empire was snatched away. I did not scream. I did not cry. I forced my racing heart to slow, engaging the analytical, freezing logic that governed my profession. I looked past Naomi's smug expression. I looked back at the document still held loosely in her manicured hand. I did not look at the legal jargon. I focused entirely on the blue ink at the bottom of the page. I analyzed the signature. I have signed my name thousands of times on financial audits, non-disclosure agreements, and server access logs. I know the precise mechanical rhythm of my own handwriting. My eyes tracked the final loop of the letter N. The angle was wrong. The pressure application was inconsistent. The tail of the letter dragged slightly downward, a subtle hesitation mark caused by someone attempting to trace a foreign motion. It was a masterful forgery, likely copied from a digital scan of my employment contract, but it lacked the fluid, confident velocity of an authentic signature. Julian had forged my signature. He had committed a severe, undeniable felony to steal my holding company's assets. A sudden white-hot fury erupted in my chest. The urge to snatch the paper from Naomi's hand, to physically attack the woman threatening to commit me to a psychiatric ward, was almost overwhelming. I locked that fury away in an iron box. A forensic auditor does not react to a forged ledger by tearing up the paper. You preserve the evidence. You let the target believe their deception is secure, and then you invite the federal authorities to examine the ink. I maintained absolute chilling silence. I did not argue. I did not accuse Julian of forgery. I simply looked at Naomi with a blank, unreadable expression. I pressed the elevator call button again. The steel doors slid open with a soft chime. I stepped inside the empty car. Naomi offered a triumphant, vicious smirk, watching the doors begin to close. She thought my silence was capitulation. She thought I was retreating in defeat. I did not break eye contact with her until the steel doors sealed shut, cutting off her smug expression. The moment the elevator began its descent, I pulled my smartphone from my pocket. I did not call a civil litigator to argue a contract dispute. A forged intellectual property transfer utilized to secure $50 million in venture capital crossed the line from a domestic business dispute into a federal criminal enterprise. During my tenure as a financial data analyst, I had collaborated on several high-profile corporate embezzlement cases. I had built a network of contacts within federal law enforcement agencies who relied on my algorithms to track dark money. I opened an encrypted messaging application. I selected a contact named Agent Miller, a senior operative within the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division, specifically attached to the Document Analysis Unit. I activated the high-resolution scanner function on my phone's camera. The brief glance at the document in the hallway was sufficient. My photographic memory retained the exact date, the header format, and the subtle imperfections of the forged signature. I typed a rapid, precise message. Miller. Julian and Naomi just presented a fraudulent intellectual property transfer agreement to bypass a $5 million penalty clause. The signature is a forgery. They intend to utilize this document to secure a $50 million venture capital acquisition next week. This constitutes wire fraud and federal forgery. I need a priority forensic handwriting analysis team on standby. I will secure the physical document. I hit send. The message encrypted and vanished into the secure network. Naomi believed she had just threatened me into submission. She did not realize she had just handed me the keys to a federal penitentiary. They had escalated the conflict from a civil boardroom dispute to a felony criminal conspiracy. The penalty was no longer a $5 million invoice. The penalty was 15 years in a federal cage. The elevator chimed, arriving at the lobby level. I stepped out, my posture straight, my mind calculating the trajectory of the impending federal strike. I needed to secure the physical document before Julian could destroy it. I needed to let them celebrate their false victory. I needed them to feel completely, utterly safe, right up until the FBI breached their doors. The encrypted message to the Federal Bureau of Investigation was delivered. The digital trap was primed. Now I required the physical evidence. I needed the original forged document bearing the ink of Julian's felony to secure a federal indictment. I expected Julian to hide the document behind a fortress of corporate lawyers. I expected him to secure it in a biometric safe. I did not expect him to deploy his most reliable destructive weapon to force my compliance. My smartphone buzzed on the passenger seat as I navigated the evening traffic away from the downtown headquarters. The caller identification displayed the name Cynthia, my mother. I let it ring 3 times, bracing myself against the inevitable emotional manipulation before I accepted the call via the vehicle's Bluetooth system. Vivian, darling. Cynthia's voice filled the cabin. The tone was artificially sweet, the exact cadence she utilized when she needed me to sacrifice my own comfort to accommodate Julian's frequent chaotic failures. You need to come to the house for dinner tonight. It is an absolute emergency. We are having a family meeting. I kept my eyes on the wet asphalt ahead. What kind of emergency? Cynthia, Julian is here. He told me everything, Vivian. Cynthia replied, the sweetness rapidly dissolving into a sharp, accusatory edge. He told me how you are acting at the office. We need to sit down as a family and resolve this behavior before you ruin his future. Be here at 7. The line disconnected. She did not ask for my availability. She issued a summons. I arrived at my mother's suburban home at precisely 7 o'clock. The neighborhood was quiet, lined with manicured lawns and aging colonial houses. It was the environment where I had spent 18 years learning that my academic achievements were merely footnotes to Julian's athletic trophies. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer. The smell of roasted chicken and tension hung heavy in the air. I walked into the formal dining room. The scene was perfectly staged for an ambush. Cynthia sat at the head of the table, her hands nervously shredding a paper napkin. Julian and Naomi sat adjacent to her, presenting a unified, formidable front. Julian wore a smug, relaxed expression, pouring himself a glass of expensive red wine. Naomi sat perfectly upright, her dark eyes tracking my entrance with cold, predatory satisfaction. They had not come to negotiate. They had come to watch my mother break my resolve. I took the single empty chair at the opposite end of the table. I did not remove my trench coat. I did not reach for a water glass. I maintained a rigid professional posture, refusing to surrender to the domestic setting. "Let us get straight to the agenda," I stated, fixing my gaze on my mother. "You called an emergency meeting. Proceed." Cynthia sighed heavily, immediately adopting the persona of the weary, long-suffering matriarch. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the lace tablecloth. Julian explained the situation with the software patent's Vivian. Cynthia began, her voice quivering with manufactured distress. "He told me you are trying to claim ownership of the company's property. He showed me the transfer agreement you signed last month." I glanced at Julian. He offered a slight, triumphant smirk, raising his wine glass in a silent, mocking toast. He had fed her the forgery. He was using her maternal authority to validate his crime. "I did not sign that document, Cynthia," I replied, my voice slicing through the thick, tense air of the dining room. "Julian forged my signature. He committed a federal crime to steal my intellectual property because he breached our licensing agreement this morning." Cynthia slammed her hand against the table, startling the silverware. "Stop lying, Vivian!" Cynthia shrieked, the volume of her voice shattering the quiet suburban evening. "Do not sit in my house and accuse your brother of a felony. I saw your signature with my own eyes. You are just bitter. You have always been jealous of Julian's charisma. You are trying to sabotage him because you cannot stand that he is the one securing the venture capital." The profound, agonizing weight of her bias settled over me. It was not a new sensation. It was a familiar, suffocating pressure I had endured my entire life. But tonight it felt different. Tonight she was not just dismissing a science fair ribbon. She was actively protecting a criminal at the expense of my freedom. Naomi leaned across the table, her voice a soft, venomous purr. "We are trying to help you, Vivian. If you continue this delusion, the corporate lawyers will destroy you." Julian reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out the original heavy stock transfer agreement. He placed it deliberately in the center of the table, right next to a silver ink pen. "Here is the solution," Julian said, his tone oozing with arrogant condescension. "Tomorrow morning you and I are going to a public notary. You are going to sign a sworn affidavit confirming this signature is authentic. You will legally attest that you transferred the intellectual property willingly." I stared at the document resting on the tablecloth. The audacity was breathtaking. They were not just demanding my silence. They were demanding my active participation in their fraud. If I signed that affidavit, I would be committing perjury. I would be legally cementing my own ruin, shielding Julian from federal prosecution by taking the fall myself. Cynthia reached out her trembling fingers, brushing the edge of the forged document. "You must do this, Vivian." Cynthia pleaded, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes, a masterful display of emotional extortion. "Julian is finalizing a $50 million acquisition from the venture capital firm next week. This is his legacy. This is our family's future. If you dispute this signature, the investors will pull out. The company will collapse." She paused, wiping a tear from her cheek, preparing to deliver the final crushing blow. "If you destroy your brother's company out of spite," Cynthia declared, her voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving register, "I will disown you. You will no longer be my daughter. You will be dead to this family." The silence in the dining room became absolute. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the adjacent kitchen. Julian and Naomi sat in perfect stillness, their eyes fixed on my face, waiting for the threat of maternal abandonment to break my spirit. They expected me to crumble. They expected the lifelong conditioning of the neglected daughter to override my logic. They expected me to pick up the silver pen and sign my life away just to secure a fraction of Cynthia's approval. I looked at my mother. I analyzed her tear-streaked face. I saw the sheer desperation to protect her golden child, a desperation so profound it blinded her to his corruption. She was perfectly willing to sacrifice my career, my financial stability, and my legal standing to ensure Julian secured his unearned fortune. The remnants of my childhood pain did not rise to the surface. The longing for a mother's love, the desperate need for validation, simply evaporated. The emotional bond dissolved into ash, replaced by a freezing, impenetrable void. I did not reach for the pen. I did not shed a tear. I stood up slowly, pushing the heavy dining chair back from the table. The wooden legs scraped harshly against the hardwood floor. I looked down at Julian, memorizing the smug confidence etched into his features. I looked at Naomi, noting the predatory satisfaction in her dark eyes. Finally, I locked my gaze onto Cynthia. "I am not your scapegoat, Cynthia." I stated, my voice devoid of any warmth, any anger, or any grief. "I am a forensic auditor. I rely on data, not emotional blackmail." Cynthia's mouth opened slightly in confusion. She had fired her most devastating weapon, and it had failed to leave a mark. "You just made your choice." I continued, my tone lowering to a chilling final decree. "You chose to protect a fraud over defending your daughter. Do not regret it when the consequences arrive." I turned my back on the table. I did not look back as I walked out of the dining room. I ignored Cynthia's sudden frantic shouting commanding me to return. I ignored Julian's arrogant laughter echoing through the hallway. I walked out the front door, stepping into the cool night air. I had lost a mother, but I had gained absolute terrifying clarity. The emotional tethers were severed. There were no longer any family members to protect. There were only targets, and the federal indictment was waiting. The immediate aftermath of the disastrous family dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Naomi did not wait for the FBI to analyze the forged signature. She did not wait for Julian's $50 million venture capital deal to close. She struck first, utilizing the only weapon she truly understood: public perception. I woke up the following morning to a smartphone vibrating relentlessly against my nightstand. The notifications were not incoming emails or calendar reminders. They were alerts from every major social media platform and professional networking site. I unlocked the screen. The digital assault was overwhelming. A prominent tech industry blog known for its aggressive, unsourced reporting had published a sprawling multi-page exposé. The headline read, "Disgraced co-founder terminated following allegations of corporate sabotage and IP theft." The article did not name Julian. It did not name the startup directly. It relied on anonymous sources and leaked internal memorandums. But it named me. The text painted a vivid, horrifying portrait of an erratic, bitter data analyst who had been quietly terminated after attempting to steal proprietary algorithms to sell to a rival firm. It alleged that I had created the separate holding company as a vehicle for corporate espionage. Naomi had meticulously crafted the narrative. She weaponized my natural introversion, spinning my quiet dedication into a profile of a sociopathic, isolated hacker. The article was a character assassination executed with terrifying precision. The fallout was instantaneous. The professional network I had cultivated over a decade evaporated in a matter of hours. My phone rang. The caller ID displayed the name of a senior partner at a prestigious financial firm where I occasionally consulted on forensic audits. I answered the call, maintaining my professional composure. Vivian, the partner, began, his voice strained and uncomfortable. "We saw the article. Our board is extremely risk-averse regarding intellectual property disputes. We have to terminate our consulting contract effective immediately. We cannot have our firm associated with these allegations." He disconnected before I could offer a defense. Over the next 6 hours, 4 more independent clients severed their ties with me. My primary source of income vanished. The digital mob descended shortly after. My professional profile was inundated with vitriolic comments from strangers. Colleagues I had previously mentored deleted their endorsements of my skills. The industry turned its back on me, accepting Naomi's fabricated narrative as absolute truth. The pressure was designed to be suffocating, a coordinated effort to bury me under a mountain of public disgrace, so I would lack the credibility to challenge the forged document in court. I sat in my home office, the blue light of the monitors illuminating the dark room. The silence of the house was oppressive, a stark contrast to the deafening roar of the digital scandal raging on my screens. A normal person might have issued a frantic public denial. A normal person might have hired a defense attorney to draft cease and desist letters. I am a forensic data analyst. I do not engage in public relations battles. I hunt for the source code. Naomi possessed a formidable network of media contacts, but she lacked a fundamental understanding of digital architecture. She operated in the realm of optics and influence, ignorant of the permanent, indelible footprints left behind by online transactions. She assumed anonymous publication equated to absolute secrecy. She had committed a fatal, catastrophic error. She left the metadata exposed. I closed the social media tabs. I opened a secure, encrypted terminal window. I initiated a trace protocol on the specific blog post that had ignited the smear campaign. I bypassed the superficial text and delved into the underlying source code of the web page. I extracted the digital headers and the embedded media files, searching for the invisible breadcrumbs left by the author. It took me 3 hours of meticulous, relentless coding. The digital trail led from the blog's server to a third-party hosting service, then bounced through a virtual private network node located in Eastern Europe. It was a sophisticated masking attempt designed to frustrate a casual inquiry. But I do not conduct casual inquiries. I cracked the proxy server logs, revealing the true origin point of the data upload. The IP address did not belong to an independent journalist. It did not belong to a rival tech firm. The IP address belonged to a boutique public relations agency located in downtown Seattle, an agency owned and operated by Naomi. I had identified the shooter. Now I needed to trace the funding. Smear campaigns of this magnitude, utilizing paid bots to amplify the article and securing prominent placement on high-traffic blogs, require significant capital. Naomi did not finance this operation out of her own pocket. I accessed the read-only master terminal for Julian's startup. I still possessed my original administrative credentials. Julian had revoked my email access and my physical keycard, but his technical incompetence meant he had failed to purge my deep-level database permissions. I initiated a comprehensive audit of the startup's operational expenditure accounts over the past 72 hours. I cross-referenced the outgoing wire transfers against the billing records of Naomi's public relations firm. The numbers aligned with devastating clarity. Naomi had not merely orchestrated a character assassination. She had funded it using the startup's corporate credit line. I traced a series of expedited payments totaling nearly $200,000 routed from the company's marketing budget directly into offshore accounts utilized to purchase the targeted media attacks and the bot networks. Julian and Naomi had embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars of investor capital to finance a personal vendetta against a co-founder. They had utilized corporate funds to execute a criminal smear campaign. I stared at the financial ledgers glowing on my monitor. The anger that had simmered beneath the surface finally cooled into a sharp, lethal focus. Naomi believed she had destroyed my reputation. She did not realize she had just documented her own federal wire fraud. I took high-resolution screenshots of the metadata trace linking the IP address to Naomi's firm. I downloaded the complete transaction logs detailing the $200,000 drained from the startup's accounts. I compiled the evidence into a secure, encrypted folder. The narrative was no longer a domestic dispute over intellectual property. It was a documented case of corporate embezzlement and financial fraud involving investor capital. The venture capitalists Julian was currently courting would not care about a family feud. They would care very deeply that their prospective CEO was actively draining the company coffers to pay his wife for illegal smear campaigns. I did not draft a rebuttal. I did not contact a lawyer. I simply added the new files to the primary dossier I was preparing for the federal authorities. Naomi had attempted to bury me in the court of public opinion. She had unwittingly provided the exact evidence required to bury her in a federal penitentiary. The digital smear campaign was merely the preliminary bombardment. Julian and Naomi required a definitive lethal strike to neutralize me before the venture capital firm finalized their $50 million investment. They needed me discredited, incarcerated, and entirely stripped of my credibility. They needed the narrative of the disgruntled, unstable sister replaced by the narrative of a convicted corporate felon. They escalated the conflict from social media character assassination to a full-scale legal assault. It occurred on a Thursday morning, precisely 4 days after Julian locked me out of the company's servers. I was sitting at my home office desk, finalizing the encrypted dossier for the federal authorities, when a sharp, authoritative pounding echoed from my front door. I did not expect a delivery. I walked to the entryway and glanced through the peephole. Two individuals stood on my porch. They did not wear the crisp suits of corporate attorneys. They wore tactical windbreakers bearing the bold yellow lettering of the Financial Crimes Task Force. One officer held a clipboard. The other rested his hand casually near his holstered sidearm. I unbolted the door and pulled it open, maintaining a neutral, unbothered expression. "Vivian." The lead officer inquired, his tone flat and procedural. "I am Vivian," I confirmed, not stepping back to invite them inside. The officer held up a heavy, multi-page document stamped with a prominent judicial seal. "We are executing a search and seizure warrant regarding allegations of grand larceny and corporate embezzlement. We need you to step aside, ma'am. We are confiscating your personal electronics, your financial records, and any documentation related to your former employment." The air in the entryway grew dense. Julian had not merely filed a civil complaint. He had sworn out a criminal affidavit accusing me of stealing from the startup. I stepped back, allowing the officers to enter my home. I did not protest. I did not shout about my innocence or demand to call a lawyer. A forensic auditor understands that a search warrant is an inevitable consequence of a fabricated ledger. Julian was playing a high-stakes game, betting that a sudden police raid would terrify me into signing a confession or fleeing the jurisdiction. The officers moved systematically through my house. They cataloged my primary desktop computer, my secondary laptop, and a stack of printed tax returns. They operated with clinical efficiency, securing the hardware they believed contained evidence of my guilt. "You need to come with us to the precinct, Vivian," the lead officer stated, securing an evidence bag containing my hard drives. "We have an active investigation open, and we require a formal statement regarding the discrepancies in the corporate accounts." I retrieved my coat from the closet. I did not tremble as I walked out to their unmarked vehicle. I rode in the back seat, observing the city streets blur past the window. Julian thought he was sending me to the slaughterhouse. He did not realize he had just provided me with a direct, uninterrupted audience with the very financial investigators I needed to expose his syndicate. The precinct interview room was sparse, furnished only with a metal table and 3 rigid chairs. The lead investigator, a sharp-eyed detective named Ramirez, sat across from me. He placed a thick binder on the table, opening it to reveal a stack of complex financial spreadsheets. "Your brother, the chief executive officer of your former startup, initiated this complaint." Detective Ramirez began, his gaze fixed on my face, searching for any sign of panic. He engaged an independent accounting firm to review the corporate ledgers following your termination. They discovered a series of unauthorized offshore transfers totaling roughly $800,000. The routing codes trace back to accounts established during your tenure as the primary data analyst. Ramirez slid a printed ledger across the table. It displayed a labyrinth of phantom transactions, fake vendor invoices, and manipulated capital allocations. Julian had hired a corrupt bottom-tier accounting firm to cook the books. They had retroactively inserted fraudulent data into the server logs, attempting to frame me as the architect of a massive embezzlement scheme. The strategy was audacious, relying on the sheer complexity of the data to overwhelm the detectives. I looked at the ledger. I did not call for an attorney. I did not invoke my right to remain silent. "Detective Ramirez," I stated, my voice calm and steady, devoid of the frantic energy of a cornered suspect. "May I borrow your pen?" Ramirez frowned, momentarily thrown off by my absolute lack of anxiety. He slid a cheap ballpoint pen across the metal table. I pulled the fabricated ledger toward me. I did not need 3 weeks and a team of analysts to dismantle the forgery. I needed 3 hours and a basic understanding of algorithmic sequencing. The firm my brother hired to fabricate these records utilized a rudimentary randomization script to generate the phantom invoices I explained, circling a cluster of transaction dates with the blue ink. Observe the timestamp intervals on these vendor payouts. They occur exactly 72 hours apart, down to the millisecond. Human financial behavior is organic and irregular. A perfectly symmetrical transaction sequence is the unmistakable signature of a poorly coded automated script. Ramirez leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he examined the circled timestamps. Furthermore, I continued flipping to the second page of the ledger. They attempted to backdate these offshore transfers to align with my tenure. However, they failed to account for the server's master synchronization clock. I pointed the pen at a string of encrypted routing numbers. This specific routing protocol was not implemented by our banking institution until 4 weeks ago. I stated delivering the lethal blow to Julian's fabricated narrative. It is technologically impossible for me to have authorized a transaction using a routing code that did not exist while I was employed there. The accounting firm did not cook the books. They microwaved them. Detective Ramirez sat back in his chair. The aggressive interrogatory posture vanished, replaced by the sharp, focused attention of an investigator, realizing the target had just become the informant. I set the pen down. My brother did not initiate this investigation to recover stolen funds, Detective. I concluded, my tone dropping to a freezing absolute certainty. He initiated this investigation to create a distraction. He needed you looking at me so you would not look at the actual hemorrhage in his corporate accounts. Ramirez crossed his arms. And what exactly should we be looking at, Vivian? I am a forensic data analyst, I replied, locking eyes with the detective. I do not steal money. I track it. And I tracked Julian's actual expenditures over the past 18 months. I proceeded to outline the genuine, unmanipulated financial reality of Julian's startup. I detailed the exact dates and the exact routing numbers involved in his massive systematic embezzlement. I explained how Julian had utilized the company's operational capital as a personal slush fund, siphoning off investor money to finance a lifestyle he could not legitimately afford. Check the corporate real estate holdings registered under the name Naomi Kensington. I instructed delivering the final devastating coordinates. You will find a $1.2 million estate in the suburbs and a luxury sports car, both purchased outright using corporate capital funneled through a disguised vendor account. The interview room remained silent for a long moment. The fabricated ledger detailing my supposed crimes lay forgotten on the table. Julian intended to frame me for grand larceny. He brought the financial authorities directly to my doorstep. In doing so, he bypassed the slow, tedious process of filing a civil complaint. He handed me the exact weapon I needed to convert his fraudulent empire into a federal crime scene. The hunter had officially become the hunted. The interview with Detective Ramirez shifted the paradigm, but local law enforcement possesses inherent limitations. Municipal financial crime units are frequently understaffed and overwhelmed by routine fraud cases. A complex, multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement scheme involving forged intellectual property transfers and manipulated algorithms could languish in the local prosecutor's office for months, perhaps years. Julian and Naomi were banking on that bureaucratic inertia. They anticipated a protracted, messy civil lawsuit regarding the breached licensing agreement. They assumed the fabricated embezzlement charges would tie me up in local court hearings, draining my resources and distracting me while they finalized the $50 million venture capital acquisition. Once the investor funds hit their accounts, they could afford the elite legal defense required to bury me permanently. I did not intend to fight them in a civil arena. Civil courts award financial damages. Federal courts hand down prison sentences. I returned to my townhouse after the precinct interview. The local authorities had confiscated my physical hardware, but a forensic analyst never stores the master ledger on a vulnerable device. My primary uncorrupted data vault existed entirely on a secure encrypted cloud server, accessible only via a multi-factor authentication sequence I carried in my head. I retrieved a pristine burner laptop I had purchased specifically for this phase of the operation. I connected to the secure network and initiated the final compilation protocol. The time for defensive maneuvers was over. I was preparing the kill shot. I assembled the evidence into a comprehensive 300-page digital dossier. It was not a chaotic collection of grievances. It was a meticulously structured, irrefutable indictment formatted to meet the exact evidentiary standards required for a federal prosecution. Section 1 detailed the intellectual property theft. I included the high-resolution scan of the transfer agreement bearing my forged signature. I appended the preliminary analysis from my contact within the document analysis unit, confirming the mechanical irregularities and the forced pen strokes indicative of a felony forgery. This established the foundational crime, the unauthorized illegal transfer of a multi-million-dollar corporate asset. Section 2 exposed the financial fraud. I integrated the genuine, unmanipulated server logs alongside the fabricated ledger Julian had presented to the local police. I highlighted the algorithmic anomalies, the impossible timestamp sequences, and the retroactive insertion of the phantom invoices. This section proved Julian had not only embezzled funds, but had actively conspired with a corrupt accounting firm to obstruct justice and frame an innocent party. Section 3 delivered the most devastating blow. It outlined the systemic ongoing fraud perpetrated against the venture capital firm. Julian and Naomi were actively soliciting $50 million in investments based on a fraudulent prospectus. They were presenting a company that owned proprietary software while deliberately concealing the revoked licensing agreement and the forged transfer documents. In the corporate sector, inflating revenue projections is a civil dispute. Lying to institutional investors regarding the fundamental ownership of the core technology is a catastrophic violation of federal securities law. I did not mail the dossier to the local police precinct. I did not leak it to the tech industry blogs Naomi utilized for her smear campaigns. I routed the encrypted file directly to the Regional Enforcement Division of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, simultaneously copying the White-Collar Crime Division of the Department of Justice. I attached a brief formal cover letter to the Office of the Enforcement Director. The attached dossier contains verified time-stamped evidence of ongoing securities fraud, felony forgery, and corporate embezzlement perpetrated by the executive leadership of the referenced startup. The subjects are currently attempting to finalize a $50 million venture capital acquisition utilizing fraudulently obtained intellectual property. I am the sole legal owner of the referenced patents. I am submitting this evidence as a formal whistleblower complaint. I pressed send. The progress bar filled, and the 300-page digital bomb vanished into the federal network. When the Securities and Exchange Commission receives actionable documented evidence of a $50 million fraud actively in progress, they do not schedule a polite preliminary hearing. They do not send a cease and desist letter. They mobilize. They coordinate with federal prosecutors to secure immediate arrest warrants and asset freezes to protect the institutional investors. The steel net was woven, anchored, and deployed. Julian and Naomi believed they were on the precipice of securing generational wealth. They were picking out luxury vehicles and planning extravagant celebrations, entirely oblivious to the federal machinery accelerating toward them. I had removed the conflict from the realm of family drama and placed it squarely under the jurisdiction of federal law. The trap was fully armed. I only needed to wait for the targets to walk into the boardroom and pick up the pen. The official signing ceremony for the venture capital acquisition was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I planned to attend. The Grand Hyatt Hotel possesses the kind of aggressive, polished luxury designed specifically for multi-million-dollar corporate transactions. The air smells of expensive floral arrangements and filtered money. On Tuesday morning, Julian and Naomi secured the premier executive suite on the top floor to finalize their venture capital acquisition. They expected a coronation. They had orchestrated the hostile takeover, silenced the dissenting shareholders, and executed a brutal smear campaign to ensure my absence. They were minutes away from securing $50 million in institutional funding. I arrived at the hotel at precisely 10 o'clock. I did not wear the charcoal suit from our previous confrontation. I wore a tailored, stark black blazer and trousers, the uniform of a professional executing a corporate liquidation. I did not approach the executive suite alone. 2 days prior, after submitting the dossier to the federal authorities, I bypassed Julian's startup entirely and contacted the venture capital firm directly. I did not speak to their public relations department or their enthusiastic investment scouts. A forensic auditor speaks to the individual responsible for protecting the capital. I contacted their chief risk officer, a notoriously cautious man named Sterling. I provided Sterling with a redacted executive summary of the fraud, explicitly detailing the forged intellectual property transfer and the impending federal investigation. I informed him that his firm was about to purchase a hollow shell. Sterling verified my credentials and agreed to accompany me to the signing ceremony. We rode the glass elevator to the top floor in total silence. Sterling held a sleek leather briefcase, his expression grave and tightly controlled. He realized his firm was seconds away from a catastrophic financial blunder. The heavy oak doors of the executive suite stood slightly ajar. We did not knock. We pushed the doors open and stepped into the room. The scene inside was perfectly staged for a victory lap. Crystal champagne flutes sat on a silver tray. Julian sat at the head of a massive mahogany table, a custom fountain pen resting between his fingers. Naomi stood behind him, her hands resting possessively on his shoulders, wearing a brilliant, triumphant smile. 3 representatives from the venture capital firm sat opposite them, reviewing the final funding agreements. Julian was mid-sentence expounding on his brilliant vision for the company's future when he noticed the movement at the door. His smile faltered. The arrogant posture rigidified. He saw me, and a flash of furious disbelief crossed his face. He opened his mouth, likely preparing to shout for security, but the words died in his throat when he recognized the man standing beside me. Sterling stepped forward, bypassing the confused venture capital representatives. He did not offer a greeting. He stopped directly across from Julian. Vivian Naomi hissed, her voice a sharp, venomous crack, breaking the sudden silence. "What are you doing here? You are trespassing. Get out before we call the police." I did not acknowledge Naomi. I did not look at my brother. I looked at the lead venture capitalist, a billionaire investor who was currently holding a contract worth $50 million. I unclasped my manila folder. I extracted 2 specific documents and placed them flat on the mahogany table directly over the venture capital funding agreement. The first document was the preliminary forensic analysis from the Federal Document Unit confirming the catastrophic irregularities in the signature on the intellectual property transfer. The second document was a certified copy of the formal whistleblower complaint currently under active review by the Securities and Exchange Commission detailing the $4 million Julian had embezzled. You are about to authorize a $50 million investment into an entity that does not possess a single line of proprietary code, I stated. My voice was quiet, lethal, and devoid of any emotional inflection. Furthermore, the executive leadership team you are funding is currently the target of an active federal investigation for securities fraud, corporate embezzlement, and felony forgery. The atmosphere in the executive suite underwent a violent, instantaneous pressure drop. The champagne flutes ceased to matter. The celebratory aura evaporated, replaced by the freezing, suffocating reality of a shattered illusion. The billionaire investor stared at the documents resting on the table. The color drained from his face, leaving a sickly ashen gray. He looked at the federal seal on the document analysis report. He looked at the stark, undeniable text of the SEC complaint. He did not ask Julian for an explanation. Billionaires do not waste time arguing with exposed frauds. They protect their capital. The investor reached across the table. He picked up the $50 million funding agreement, the contract Julian had spent 3 years lying and stealing to secure. He gripped the thick stack of premium paper in both hands. With a sharp, decisive motion, the billionaire tore the contract directly in half. The sound of tearing paper echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. He tossed the ruined halves onto the table directly in front of Julian. "This deal is dead," the investor commanded, his voice shaking with a cold, terrifying fury. "If you ever contact my firm again, I will personally ensure you never work in this sector for the rest of your life." He stood up, signaling his team. They gathered their briefcases and marched out of the suite, followed closely by Sterling. The entire transaction, the culmination of Julian and Naomi's ruthless ambition, had been annihilated in less than 60 seconds. Julian sat frozen in his chair, staring at the torn contract. The fountain pen slipped from his fingers, rolling across the table and dropping onto the carpet. His mouth hung slightly open, his mind unable to process the absolute, instantaneous destruction of his empire. The $50 million he believed he had secured had vanished, replaced by the impending reality of federal indictments. Naomi's hands slowly slid off Julian's shoulders. The predatory arrogance that defined her entire existence had been crushed into powder. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, uncomprehending terror. I did not offer a parting insult. I did not gloat over their ruined victory. I simply picked up my empty folder, turned my back on the wreckage I had orchestrated, and walked out of the suite. The silence I left behind was the heaviest, most devastating punishment I could deliver. The destruction of the venture capital acquisition was not the final blow. It was the catalyst. A forensic auditor understands that removing the primary revenue stream from a fraudulent enterprise triggers an immediate catastrophic structural collapse. Julian had constructed an empire entirely on the promise of future funding spending capital he did not possess to project an illusion of invincibility. The illusion shattered before the sun set on Tuesday. To finance Naomi's aggressive public relations smear campaign and maintain their opulent lifestyle during the negotiation phase, Julian had executed a desperate financial maneuver. He secured a high-risk $3 million bridge loan from a predatory private lending institution. He collateralized the loan utilizing his personal assets and his anticipated equity in the startup. Julian assumed the $50 million venture capital injection would cover the bridge loan with a massive margin to spare. He wagered his entire existence on a signature he failed to secure. The financial sector operates on rumors and risk assessment. Word of the venture capital firm's abrupt, furious withdrawal from the signing ceremony swept through the Seattle investment community within hours. The private lending institution, alerted to the sudden evaporation of Julian's primary collateral, did not wait for a missed payment. They activated the default clauses embedded deep within the loan agreement. The financial guillotine dropped at precisely 7 o'clock that evening. Naomi was hosting a celebratory dinner at an exclusive Michelin-starred restaurant downtown, entertaining a group of high-profile media executives she intended to poach for her agency. She wore a new designer gown, ordering expensive champagne and caviar, basking in the anticipated glory of the startup's multi-million-dollar valuation. When the bill arrived, Naomi casually dropped her sleek metal corporate credit card onto the silver tray. She did not even look at the total. The waiter returned 3 minutes later. He leaned down, his voice hushed and incredibly uncomfortable. "I apologize, ma'am, but this card has been declined." Naomi frowned, irritated by the administrative error. She retrieved the card and handed him her personal platinum debit card. "Run this one. The chip reader is likely malfunctioning." The waiter returned again, his posture rigid with embarrassment. "I am very sorry, ma'am. This card is also declining. The terminal indicates a comprehensive account freeze." The conversation around the table died instantly. The media executives, individuals whose careers depended on assessing the financial viability of their clients, stared at Naomi. The projection of limitless wealth evaporated in the harsh reality of a rejected payment. Naomi's face flushed a deep, mottled red. She scrambled through her designer clutch, attempting to locate another card, a cash reserve, anything to mitigate the devastating public humiliation. Every single account connected to Julian's name, both corporate and personal, had been frozen by the lending institution pending a massive asset seizure. She was forced to endure the excruciating indignity of watching one of the media executives quietly pay the exorbitant bill, their eyes silently judging the woman who had just boasted about a $50 million windfall. The elegant veneer of the power couple dissolved the moment Naomi burst through the front door of their luxury penthouse apartment. Julian was pacing the living room, a half-empty bottle of scotch in his hand, his phone pressed to his ear as he frantically attempted to reach his bankers. Naomi did not ask for an explanation. She crossed the expensive hardwood floor in 3 furious strides. She drew her hand back and slapped Julian across the face with explosive, unbridled force. The sharp crack echoed through the cavernous penthouse. Julian stumbled, dropping his phone, the device clattering against the floorboards. "You lied to me!" Naomi shrieked, her voice stripped of its usual calculated control, raw with genuine panic. "You told me the bridge loan was secure. You told me the venture capital was guaranteed. My cards are declining in front of my clients, Julian. I was just humiliated." Julian rubbed his jaw, his own panic morphing into defensive rage. "Do not blame this on me, Naomi," he roared back, spittle flying from his lips. "You are the one who drained the corporate accounts to run those pathetic smear campaigns against Vivian. You spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on bots and fake articles. If you had not incinerated our operational budget on your petty revenge, I would not have needed the bridge loan. You needed the loan because your sister outsmarted you." Naomi spat, delivering a vicious psychological strike. "You stole her code, you forged her signature, and you still managed to lose the entire company. You are a failure, Julian. You have always been a failure, hiding behind her intellect. The toxic alliance, bound together solely by shared greed and a mutual desire to destroy me, consumed itself in a matter of minutes. The penthouse became a war zone of shouted accusations and shattered glass. Julian blamed Naomi's excessive spending and strategic blunders. Naomi blamed Julian's incompetence and his catastrophic miscalculation of my resolve. They tore each other apart, stripping away the excuses and the false narratives until nothing remained but the ugly, undeniable truth. They had gambled everything they possessed to steal an empire, and they had lost entirely. The financial freeze was merely the beginning of the nightmare. The federal authorities were already reviewing the dossier, and the true consequences of their actions were rapidly approaching. The shockwaves of Julian's financial ruin did not remain confined to his luxury penthouse. A collapsing structure invariably damages its foundational supports. I anticipated a reaction from my mother, but I severely underestimated the depth of her complicity. It occurred on a Thursday evening 2 days after the venture capital deal disintegrated. I was sitting at my kitchen island reviewing the preliminary response from the Securities and Exchange Commission when the doorbell rang. It was not a polite, scheduled chime. It was a frantic, continuous buzzing, accompanied by the heavy sound of an open palm pounding against the wood. I checked the security camera feed on my phone. Cynthia stood on my front porch. She looked completely unhinged. Her hair was disheveled, her coat thrown hastily over her shoulders, her face contorted in absolute panic. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. I did not step aside to invite her inside. "Vivian, you have to stop this," Cynthia sobbed, bypassing any form of greeting. She grabbed the edge of the doorframe, her knuckles turning white. "Julian just called me. The banks froze his accounts. He says federal agents are contacting his investors. You are destroying his life." I looked at my mother. I analyzed her frantic behavior, noting the total absence of concern for the daughter she had emotionally blackmailed just a week prior. "I am not destroying his life, Cynthia," I replied, my voice cool and unyielding. "Julian destroyed his own life when he forged a legal document and committed federal wire fraud. I merely provided the authorities with the accurate ledgers." Cynthia's knees suddenly buckled. The proud, manipulative matriarch collapsed onto the concrete porch. She knelt before me, clutching at the hem of my trousers, her tears spilling over her cheeks. "Please, Vivian, I am begging you." Cynthia wailed, the sound loud and pathetic in the quiet evening air. "You have to retract the complaints. You have to tell the investigators it was a misunderstanding. You have to save your brother." I looked down at the woman weeping on my porch. She was not begging for forgiveness. She was begging for a reprieve from the consequences of her golden child's actions. "I cannot retract verified evidence, Cynthia," I stated, stepping back slightly to break her grip on my clothing. "Julian's actions are now a matter of federal jurisdiction. The investigation is out of my hands." Cynthia let out a sharp, choked gasp. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a terror that finally eclipsed her maternal bias. "You do not understand, Vivian." Cynthia cried the horrific truth, spilling out in a frantic rush. "I gave him the money to retain the criminal defense attorneys. I took out a secondary mortgage on the house. I leveraged $500,000 against the property to help him fight the charges." The air in the entryway turned freezing cold. The magnitude of her betrayal was absolute. I stared at my mother, processing the financial reality of her confession. She had not merely offered Julian emotional support. She had actively financed his legal defense using her primary residence as collateral. She had literally bet her home on the survival of a convicted fraud. If Julian goes to federal prison, he cannot pay back the bridge loans. Cynthia sobbed, rocking back and forth on the concrete. "The banks will seize his assets. He will not be able to repay the mortgage. The bank will foreclose on the house, Vivian. I will be evicted. I will be homeless. You cannot do this to me. You cannot force your own mother onto the street." The audacity was breathtaking. She had willingly jeopardized her own shelter to protect the son who stole my company, and she was now attempting to hold me responsible for the impending foreclosure. She expected me to absorb the guilt of her catastrophic financial gamble. The last remaining thread of familial obligation severed, cleanly vanishing into the cold night air. I looked down at the woman kneeling on the porch. I felt no pity. I felt no obligation to rescue her from the wreckage she had engineered. "You are not losing your house because of me, Cynthia," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register that cut through her hysterical crying. "You are losing your house because you gambled your entire future on a criminal. You chose to finance a fraud." Cynthia stared up at me, her mouth hanging open in stunned silence. She expected me to crumble under the threat of her homelessness. She expected the dutiful, scapegoated daughter to rush to her rescue. I reached out and grasped the edge of the heavy front door. "I wish you the best of luck with your investment, Cynthia," I stated softly. I did not wait for her response. I closed the door, the heavy latch clicking firmly into place, sealing out her sobs. I engaged the deadbolt. The profound silence inside my townhouse was the sound of a toxic bond permanently breaking. She had made her choice, and now she would live in the house that choice built right up until the bank took it away. The structural collapse of the Julian and Naomi syndicate accelerated rapidly following the frozen bank accounts and the looming federal investigation. Predators bound together solely by shared greed possess zero loyalty when the resources evaporate. Naomi Kensington did not build her career by going down with sinking ships. She built it by identifying the quickest exit strategy, regardless of who she had to sacrifice to secure it. 48 hours after Cynthia's pathetic display on my porch, my encrypted email terminal pinged with an incoming message. The sender address was a secure anonymous proxy, but the tone of the message was unmistakably Naomi. "Vivian, we need to meet. I have the original source files for the forged intellectual property transfer. I can prove Julian executed the forgery entirely on his own. Name the location. Come alone." I stared at the screen. The sheer breathtaking treachery was impressive even for Naomi. She realized Julian was an unsalvageable liability. She realized the federal indictment was inevitable. She was attempting a desperate pivot, seeking to sell out her husband to secure her own immunity and a golden parachute. I did not ignore the message. I provided a location. A quiet, upscale coffee shop in the financial district located precisely 2 blocks from the federal courthouse. I arrived 10 minutes early. I selected a corner table, positioning myself with a clear view of the entrance and my back to the wall. I did not order coffee. I engaged the high-definition recording application on my smartphone and placed the device face down on the table, the microphone perfectly angled to capture the conversation. Naomi arrived precisely on time. The transformation was stark. The aggressive, designer-clad public relations executive who had publicly humiliated me in the corporate lobby was gone. She wore a simple, unbranded trench coat, dark sunglasses, and a tense, hunted expression. She slid into the chair opposite me, clutching a small, black, external hard drive tightly in her manicured hand. She removed her sunglasses, her dark eyes darting nervously around the quiet cafe. "Let us skip the pleasantries," Naomi began, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "I know you submitted a dossier to the Securities and Exchange Commission. I know the federal agents are preparing the warrants. Julian is finished, but I am not going down with him." I maintained a blank, unreadable expression. I let the silence stretch, forcing her to fill the void with her desperation. "I have the hard drive, Vivian." Naomi continued, tapping the black device resting on the table. "It contains the raw digital files Julian used to splice your signature onto the transfer agreement. It contains the deleted emails where he outlined the forgery protocol. It is the definitive proof you need to ensure he faces the maximum federal penalty while completely exonerating you from any counterclaims." She leaned forward, dropping the final condition. "I will hand over the drive right now." Naomi stated, her tone shifting from desperate to transactional. "In exchange, you will wire $200,000 into an offshore account I provide. You will also sign a legally binding affidavit stating that I had zero knowledge of the forgery or the embezzlement, granting me complete civil and criminal immunity regarding your assets." I looked at the woman sitting across from me. She was attempting to extort the victim of her own conspiracy. She expected me to pay her for evidence she was legally obligated to surrender, while simultaneously granting her a free pass for the smear campaigns and the stolen investor capital. I did not express outrage. I did not laugh at the absurdity of her demand. I simply reached out and picked up my smartphone. I flipped the device over, revealing the active recording screen. The red timer ticked steadily, capturing every single word of her extortion attempt. Naomi's eyes widened in sudden, absolute terror. Her gaze locked onto the red recording icon, the realization dawning that she had just confessed to possessing evidence of a federal crime and attempting to sell it for cash. "What are you doing?" Naomi hissed, her voice cracking as she lunged across the small table, frantically attempting to snatch the phone from my grip. I pulled the device back smoothly, keeping it well out of her reach. I tapped the screen, stopping the recording. I saved the audio file with a precise, clinical click. "I am finalizing the audit, Naomi." I replied, my voice dropping to a freezing, lethal register. "You do not dictate terms to the auditor. I did not negotiate. I did not offer a counterproposal." I opened my email application, attached the audio file I had just recorded, and entered a single recipient address: Julian. I looked directly into Naomi's panicked eyes as my thumb hovered over the send icon. "Julian believes you are currently meeting with crisis management lawyers to protect the company," I stated softly. "He is going to be very disappointed to learn his wife is actively trying to sell him to the federal authorities for $200,000. "No, wait, Vivian, please." Naomi gasped, her aristocratic facade entirely shattered. "If you send that, he will destroy me. He knows about the offshore accounts. He knows about the smear campaign funds. He will tell the FBI everything to drag me down with him." I pressed send. The progress bar filled instantly. The email containing Naomi's ultimate betrayal transmitted directly to Julian's primary device. The alliance of convenience built on arrogance and sustained by stolen capital officially detonated. I had not merely declined her extortion attempt. I had armed the bomb and tossed it back into their shared bunker. I stood up from the table, adjusting my blazer. I looked down at the woman trembling in the coffee shop chair. "You should leave the country, Naomi." I suggested, my tone devoid of any empathy. "I imagine Julian will be calling you very shortly." I turned my back on her and walked out of the cafe, leaving the black hard drive sitting on the table. I did not need the spliced signature files. The Federal Bureau of Investigation Document Analysis Unit already possessed enough evidence to secure the indictment. I simply needed to ensure that when the federal agents breached the corporate headquarters, they found two conspirators too busy destroying each other to mount a coordinated defense. The final stage was set. The psychological warfare was complete. The internal syndicate had atomized. Now the physical execution required absolute, overwhelming federal force. I did not have to wait long. The Securities and Exchange Commission, acting in coordination with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division, operates with a devastating lack of hesitation once the evidence threshold is breached. My comprehensive dossier, combined with the sudden frantic attempts by Julian to move capital, following the collapse of the venture capital deal, triggered an immediate synchronized raid. It occurred on a Tuesday afternoon, precisely at 12:30. I did not sit in my home office waiting for a news alert. I drove downtown, securing a table at a small, unassuming espresso bar located directly across the street from the corporate headquarters. The very same building where Julian and Naomi had publicly humiliated me and dumped my belongings onto the pavement just 2 weeks prior. I ordered a double espresso. I opened my laptop, checked the encrypted data streams, and watched the street through the large plate glass window. At exactly 12:32, a fleet of unmarked dark SUVs abruptly pulled up to the curb, effectively barricading the main entrance of the glass-fronted tower. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers, emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI and SEC, poured out of the vehicles. They did not pause at the reception desk. They moved with clinical aggressive precision, bypassing the building security and surging through the revolving turnstiles. Through the expansive lobby windows, I possessed an unobstructed view of the raid unfolding. The startup employees' individuals who had blindly followed Julian's arrogant directives froze in shock. The frantic hum of the tech company died instantly, replaced by the shouted commands of federal agents securing the perimeter. Agents fanned out, locking down the elevators, seizing the main server terminals, and blockading every possible exit. Julian was caught entirely off guard. He was standing in the center of the sprawling lobby, flanked by his remaining panicked executives, frantically yelling into his smartphone. He was likely screaming at his attorneys, demanding a strategy to combat the frozen bank accounts and the betrayal of his wife. He did not see the federal agents approaching from his blind spot. 2 lead FBI agents closed the distance, grabbing Julian roughly by the shoulders. The smartphone slipped from his grasp, shattering against the polished marble floor. Julian thrashed wildly, his face contorting in shock and outrage, attempting to assert his non-existent authority. "Do you know who I am?" Julian roared, his voice muffled by the thick glass, but the arrogant posture unmistakable. "You cannot do this. I am the chief executive officer." The agents did not engage in debate. They did not read his corporate title. They efficiently swept his legs, forcing the self-proclaimed visionary to his knees in the center of the lobby. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed clearly, locking his wrists tightly behind his back. He was pinned to the floor, humiliated and restrained in full view of the hundreds of employees he had terrorized and manipulated. The facade of the untouchable tech genius was completely eradicated, replaced by the pathetic reality of a cornered felon. Meanwhile, Naomi attempted a desperate, cowardly escape. She had abandoned Julian the moment she received the audio recording of her attempted extortion. She was rushing toward the secondary freight exit located at the rear of the lobby, clutching a designer overnight bag, intending to slip away before the authorities secured the building. She severely underestimated the thoroughness of my forensic audit. I had not merely exposed Julian's intellectual property theft. I had meticulously documented the money laundering pipeline flowing directly through Naomi's public relations firm. I had provided the SEC with the exact routing numbers connecting the stolen corporate capital to her offshore accounts. 2 female SEC agents intercepted Naomi mere feet from the freight doors. Naomi shrieked, kicking and fighting with a frantic, unhinged ferocity. She swung her heavy designer bag at the agents, abandoning the polished, aristocratic persona she utilized to belittle my working-class background. She fought like a cornered animal, screaming obscenities, as the agents wrestled her against the concrete wall. They secured the handcuffs, hauling the struggling public relations executive back toward the main lobby to join her husband. The federal authorities marched Julian and Naomi out through the sliding glass doors, right past the exact spot where they had ordered security to discard my cardboard box. They did not look defiant. They did not look arrogant. The agents had draped dark, heavy jackets over their heads to shield them from the gathering crowd of onlookers and local news crews. They were paraded across the pavement, stripped of their dignity, their wealth, and their freedom, and shoved into the back of the waiting federal vehicles. I sat in the espresso bar holding the warm ceramic cup. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark coffee. I did not smile. I did not experience a sudden rush of vindictive joy. I simply watched the black SUVs merge into the downtown traffic, carrying the architects of my attempted ruin toward a federal holding facility. The ledgers were balanced. The toxic variables had been systematically eliminated from the equation. I closed my laptop, the screen going dark. The operation was complete. The news cycle moves with a predatory speed when a tech executive falls from grace. By Wednesday morning, the footage of the federal raid dominated every financial news network across the country. I sat at my kitchen island, sipping a cup of dark roast coffee, watching the silent broadcast on a flat-screen monitor. The financial analysts on the television debated the sudden spectacular implosion of a startup that had been valued at $50 million just 24 hours prior. The venture capital firm had issued a swift, sterile press release officially distancing themselves from the indicted executives. The private lending institution that held the $3 million bridge loan filed an emergency motion to seize all remaining corporate assets. The startup was dead. The structure had collapsed because the foundation was a lie. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, my personal cellular phone rang. The caller identification displayed a restricted number. I knew who was operating on the other end of the line. When federal agents execute a synchronized raid, they seize all personal electronics. The suspects are granted one phone call from the holding facility. They use that call to contact legal representation. The lawyers then begin dialing the only individuals who possess the power to mitigate the damage. I accepted the call, pressing the device to my ear. I did not offer a greeting. Vivian, a voice stated. The tone was exhausted, strained, and stripped of the polished arrogance I had heard during previous encounters. This is Attorney Harrison. I am calling on behalf of Julian. I am currently stationed at the Federal Detention Center. I remained silent, allowing the high-priced corporate litigator to steep in his own discomfort. He had previously threatened to bury me in a mountain of civil lawsuits. Now he was calling from a concrete room, trying to negotiate terms for a client wearing handcuffs. The federal prosecutors are offering a harsh plea arrangement. Harrison continued, his voice wavering slightly, lacking its usual confident cadence. The wire fraud and embezzlement charges carry mandatory minimums. Julian is looking at a very long time behind bars. The investors want their money back. The lenders are calling in the debts. State your purpose for this call, counselor, I instructed, cutting through his grim summary of the situation. I do not require a status report on the federal justice system." Harrison exhaled a shaky breath. "He is your brother Vivian. He made a terrible mistake. But we can still salvage a portion of this situation. If you agree to a civil settlement, we can present a unified front to the authorities." I waited for the punchline. The sheer audacity of the impending request was palpable through the cellular connection. "If you formally grant the intellectual property rights to the startup," Harrison pleaded, lowering his voice into a tone of manufactured desperation, "the venture capital firm might be willing to return to the negotiating table. The technology is still viable. If they inject the $50 million, Julian can repay the bridge loan. He can reimburse the defrauded shareholders. The federal judge will view the restitution favorably. It will drastically reduce his sentencing guidelines. We can keep him out of a maximum security facility." The lawyer paused, letting the silence stretch, hoping the weight of the familial bond would override my logic. "Your brother is facing 15 years in a federal penitentiary," Vivian Harrison whispered, playing his final pathetic card. "Please, have some mercy." I sat in my quiet kitchen. I looked at the sleek, clean lines of the marble countertop. I thought about the night Julian locked me out of the servers I built. I thought about Naomi instructing security to throw my belongings onto the wet pavement. I thought about the forged signature designed to steal my life's work. I did not feel a sudden surge of familial guilt. I did not feel the tug of a shared childhood or the desire to rescue a man who had actively plotted my financial ruin. I laughed. It was not a quiet, polite chuckle. It was a sharp, resonant, echoing laugh that filled the kitchen. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated clarity. It was the sound of a mathematician observing a novice attempt to solve an equation using fabricated numbers. Harrison fell silent on the other end of the line. The sound of my laughter shattered his carefully constructed narrative of the forgiving, compliant sister. "You are operating under a fundamental miscalculation, counselor," I stated, my laughter fading into a freezing, razor-sharp edge. "You assume I harbor a lingering emotional attachment to the man sitting in that holding cell." I stood up from the kitchen stool, walking toward the large window overlooking the city street. "You are asking me to surrender a $5 million asset to a convicted fraud." I continued dismantling his proposal piece by piece. "You are asking me to legitimize a forged document. You are asking me to rescue a syndicate that attempted to destroy my career and commit me to a psychiatric ward." "But he is your family," Harrison stammered, clinging to the only argument he had left. "I am not in the business of mercy, Harrison," I declared, delivering the final lethal verdict. "I am a forensic auditor. I balance ledgers. And your client's books are in the red. He cannot afford my technology, and he certainly cannot afford his freedom." I tapped the red icon on my screen, terminating the connection. I immediately accessed the phone settings and permanently blocked the number. The transaction was closed. I would never hear my brother's voice or the voice of his legal proxies ever again. The dominoes Julian had lined up fell in rapid, uninterrupted succession over the next 30 days. The private lending institution executed their asset seizure protocol with ruthless efficiency. They foreclosed on the luxury penthouse apartment, evicting Julian while he sat in a federal cell awaiting trial. The bank impounded the high-end sports cars. The court froze all remaining investment portfolios to secure funds for investor restitution. Julian lost his company, his home, and his wealth in a matter of weeks. He also lost his wife. Naomi did not stand by her husband during his darkest hour. The moment she posted bail using the last remnants of her hidden offshore reserves, she filed for divorce. She instructed her defense attorneys to sever her case from Julian's actively offering to testify against him regarding the forged signature to secure a lighter sentence for her own money laundering charges. The toxic alliance built on shared arrogance and stolen funds devoured itself. The devastation extended far beyond the walls of the federal detention center. It reached deep into the quiet, manicured suburbs. Cynthia's desperate gamble to save her golden child imploded exactly as the mathematics dictated. The secondary mortgage she had taken out on her primary residence required monthly payments she could not sustain on a fixed income. The $500,000 she handed to the criminal defense attorneys vanished into billable hours. When Julian's assets were seized, the lifeline Cynthia had anticipated was severed. She missed the first mortgage payment. She missed the second, the bank, operating without sentiment or pity, initiated formal foreclosure proceedings. 2 months after the federal raid, the sheriff arrived at Cynthia's suburban colonial house. They posted a stark neon notice on the front door announcing the impending public auction of the property. Cynthia was forced to pack her belongings into cheap cardboard boxes. The woman who had proudly hosted dinner parties to mock my career trajectory was now boxing up her life under the supervision of a county deputy. She relocated to a cramped ground-floor rental apartment in a rundown complex on the outskirts of the city. She traded her manicured lawn and her spacious dining room for peeling linoleum and noisy neighbors. She had threatened to disown me to protect a fraud. The universe simply honored her request, stripping her of the very shelter she had leveraged to support a criminal. I did not drive out to the suburbs to watch her load the moving truck. I did not send a sympathetic text message. The silence I maintained was the heaviest, most brutal punishment I could deliver. Every crime they committed, every insult they hurled, and every illegal maneuver they executed had been paid in full by their own unchecked greed. The ledger was finally perfectly balanced. The debts were collected. The only remaining task was the liquidation of the empty corporate shell they left behind. I checked the public auction listings on my monitor, preparing for the final acquisition. 6 months passed. The chaotic media storm surrounding the federal indictments gradually subsided, replaced by the slow grinding machinery of the bankruptcy courts. Julian's tech startup, once heralded as a $50 million industry disruptor, was officially declared insolvent. The federal government seized the remaining physical assets to satisfy the mountain of outstanding debts owed to the defrauded investors and the private lending institutions. The corporate shell was scheduled for a public liquidation auction. It was a bleak administrative process designed to wring the last remaining pennies from a failed enterprise. The auction was held in a sterile, windowless conference room inside a municipal government building. The air smelled of cheap floor wax and stale coffee. I arrived 10 minutes before the proceedings began. I did not wear the aggressive white suit from the charity gala or the severe black blazer from the venture capital ambush. I wore a simple tailored gray wool coat over a navy turtleneck, the attire of a professional arriving to conduct routine business. The room was sparsely populated. A few sharp-eyed liquidation specialists sat in the back rows scanning the asset catalog for undervalued office equipment or server hardware they could flip for a quick profit. A bored-looking federal bankruptcy trustee sat at a folding table at the front of the room, shuffling a stack of legal documents. I took a seat in the second row, placing my leather briefcase on the empty chair beside me. The trustee tapped a pen against a microphone, calling the room to order. He droned through the preliminary legal disclaimers, detailing the terms of the Chapter 7 bankruptcy liquidation. He announced that the corporate entity formerly known as Apex Logistics Solutions was being offered as a comprehensive asset package. This package included the physical server banks, the office furniture, the existing client databases, and the remaining service contracts. The trustee cleared his throat, pausing to look over his reading glasses at the small audience. I must state for the record, the trustee announced, his voice echoing flatly in the quiet room. The intellectual property associated with the predictive logistics algorithm is not included in this asset package. The federal court determined that the software patents were never legally owned by the bankrupt entity. Furthermore, the successful bidder will assume responsibility for any outstanding secured creditor claims attached to the corporate infrastructure. A murmur rippled through the liquidation specialists sitting behind me. Buying a tech company without its core software is akin to purchasing a high-performance vehicle without an engine. It is a hollow shell, useless to a standard investor. The value of the asset package plummeted instantaneously in the minds of the men holding the bidding paddles. The trustee opened the bidding. The starting price was set at $500,000, a microscopic fraction of the company's former $50 million valuation. The room remained silent. No one raised a paddle. The liquidation specialists stared at their phones, entirely uninterested in acquiring a gutted logistics firm saddled with potential legal liabilities. The trustee sighed, preparing to lower the starting bid to generate interest. I raised my hand. I did not hold a numbered paddle. I held a single, heavily redacted legal document. "Excuse me, sir," I stated, my voice cutting cleanly through the stale air. "I am not submitting a cash bid. I am executing a secured creditor claim against the assets." The trustee frowned, shuffling through the thick stack of bankruptcy filings on his folding table. He located the relevant section, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. He looked up at me, his expression shifting from bored indifference to sharp, focused attention. "You are Vivian Kensington," the trustee confirmed, reading the name off the official creditor registry, "managing director of the holding firm holding the primary software license." "That is correct," I replied, standing up from my chair and smoothing the front of my gray coat. "As per the federal court ruling, the bankrupt entity owes my holding firm a $5 million penalty fee for breach of contract. That debt is secured against the physical assets and the client databases of the corporation." I walked forward, closing the distance between the second row and the trustee's table. I placed the certified copy of the federal judgment directly in front of him. "I am executing a credit bid," I announced, ensuring my enunciation was flawless. "I am utilizing the outstanding $5 million debt owed to my holding firm to purchase the entire asset package outright." The liquidation specialists in the back row sat up straight, suddenly realizing they were witnessing a masterclass in corporate acquisition. A credit bid is a perfectly legal, ruthlessly efficient mechanism utilized in bankruptcy auctions. When a secured creditor is owed money by a bankrupt entity, they do not need to bring cash to the auction. They can use the value of the debt itself as currency to bid on the assets. Julian had breached the licensing agreement, triggering the $5 million penalty. His company did not possess the capital to pay the invoice. Therefore, the debt became a massive, secured lien against the entire startup. I was not buying his company. I was foreclosing on it. The trustee reviewed the certified judgment. He examined the embossed federal seal. He looked at the empty room, confirming no other bidder was prepared to offer $5 million in cash for a company missing its core software. The trustee picked up his gavel. Seeing no competing cash bids exceeding the secured creditor claim, the trustee announced, his voice ringing with finality. "The comprehensive asset package is awarded to the holding firm represented by Vivian Kensington, satisfying a portion of the outstanding $5 million judgment." He struck the sound block. The sharp crack echoed in the windowless room. The transaction was complete. I did not smile. I did not pump my fist in the air. I nodded politely to the trustee, retrieved my document, and turned to walk back to my seat. In a matter of 3 minutes, utilizing the exact penalty clause Julian had mocked during our midnight confrontation, I had legally acquired the entire infrastructure of the startup he tried to steal. I possessed the server banks. I possessed the expansive client databases. I possessed the lucrative service contracts he had spent 3 years negotiating. I acquired all of it for zero out-of-pocket cash. I bought a multi-million-dollar corporate infrastructure utilizing a debt that Julian himself had created by locking me out of the building. I retrieved my leather briefcase from the chair. I walked out of the municipal building and stepped onto the busy downtown sidewalk. The afternoon traffic roared past, oblivious to the monumental transfer of power that had just occurred inside the sterile conference room. I had not merely reclaimed my intellectual property. I had swallowed Julian's entire operation whole. I took the company he built, stripped away his name, and legally integrated the physical assets into my own holding firm. I engineered a hostile takeover, utilizing his own greed as the financing mechanism. The logic was mathematically perfect. The execution was flawless. The empire was entirely mine. Exactly 365 days have passed since the wooden gavel struck the sound block in the municipal bankruptcy court. The passage of one single year can bring about profound seismic shifts in the architecture of a person's life if the foundation is built on empirical data rather than fragile emotions. I am currently standing on the top floor of the corporate headquarters, looking out through the expansive glass windows at the sprawling Seattle skyline. The morning sun reflects off the surrounding steel skyscrapers, casting a sharp, clean light across the surface of my desk. The executive suite no longer resembles a pretentious playground designed to impress shallow socialites. I ordered a rigorous renovation during my very first week in charge. I stripped away the useless antique decorations and the expensive imported rugs the former leadership utilized to flaunt their stolen wealth. The space is now sleek, highly functional, and organized with clinical precision. Glass walls enclose ergonomic workstations, and digital displays track global logistics routes in real time. I rebranded the corporation the morning the court finalized the asset transfer. The new company name reflects the core algorithm devoid of any familial ties or toxic history. It operates under my sole ownership. The transition was seamless because I already possessed the operational blueprints. I merely excised the dead weight. When I initially acquired the bankrupt entity, the existing client base experienced a brief period of uncertainty. They had witnessed the federal raid on the news. They were concerned about supply chain disruptions. I did not deploy a public relations team to feed them empty promises. I personally contacted every chief operating officer in our database. I provided them with a transparent, factual summary of the restructuring process. I demonstrated the uninterrupted functionality of the software. I offered a temporary strategic reduction in licensing fees to stabilize the relationships during the transition. Transparency breeds trust. Within a single month, we retained 95% of the original client portfolio. The revenue streams stabilized. The foundation hardened into concrete. Yesterday afternoon, I sat across from the senior partners of a Tier 1 venture capital firm. They did not arrive with the suspicion and hesitation that clouded Julian's final desperate days. They arrived with a finalized term sheet. An institutional investor evaluates risk. Julian presented them with a facade built on forged signatures and embezzled funds. I presented them with an impenetrable fortress. The corporate entity is now a pristine, unencumbered asset. There are no hidden liabilities, no pending litigation, and no offshore shell companies draining the pension accounts. The financial ledgers are flawless. The partners recognize the raw, undeniable value of the predictive logistics software combined with a clean, extensive client database. They did not offer $50 million. They wired $80 million into the corporate accounts this morning in exchange for a minority equity stake. I retained total executive control. The capital will fund our expansion into international markets. The numbers aligned perfectly. The contrast between my current reality and the fate of the individuals who attempted to discard me is a testament to the unforgiving nature of mathematics. The federal justice system operates on a slow, grinding schedule, but it eventually collects its due. Julian is currently residing in a federal correctional institution, serving the sentence handed down for wire fraud and forgery. He traded his tailored suits for standard-issue uniform fabrics. The superficial charm he utilized to manipulate investors holds zero currency among federal inmates. He possesses no assets, no influence, and no audience. Naomi's public relations firm dissolved. The industry blacklisted her the moment the details of the smear campaign and the money laundering surfaced. She is navigating the harsh reality of a ruined reputation, discovering that deleting digital metadata is impossible once the authorities seize the servers. She attempted to leverage her husband's crimes for immunity, and the resulting fallout destroyed her credibility permanently. She traded her Michelin star dinners for the obscurity she always feared. Cynthia resides in a cramped ground-floor apartment on the outskirts of the city. The bank foreclosed on her suburban colonial house months ago. She gambled her shelter to finance a criminal defense for a fraud, and the bank reclaimed the collateral. She threatened to disown me to protect her favorite child. I simply allowed the universe to honor her request. I changed my phone number. I secured my residential address through a blind trust. Cynthia cannot send an email or mail a letter. The isolation she faces is entirely self-inflicted. I do not monitor their daily lives. I do not harbor a burning vindictive joy regarding their downfalls. They simply cease to be relevant variables in my equation. I walk over to the window, resting my hand against the cool glass. The rain is falling today, a steady gray drizzle washing the streets below. I remember standing on the wet pavement outside the old headquarters, holding a damp cardboard box containing a shattered coffee mug. I remember the cold water seeping into my coat, while my brother and his wife stood behind the lobby doors, smiling at my eviction. They believed they had stripped me of my power. They failed to understand that power does not reside in a corner office or an executive title. Power resides in the ability to interpret the data, identify the vulnerabilities, and execute a strategy without hesitation. People frequently ask me how I survived the sudden loss of my career, my family, and my reputation all in a single morning. Survival is not a product of luck, it is a product of strategy. Looking back at the wreckage Julian and Naomi left behind, I can distill the architecture of my victory into 3 distinct lessons. First, silence is a weapon, not a weakness. When manipulators corner you, they expect a chaotic emotional response. They want you to scream, to cry, to beg for an explanation. They feed on your panic because it validates their control. I refused to grant my brother and my mother that satisfaction. When they insulted me at the dinner table or threatened me in the lobby, I kept my mouth shut and opened my encrypted servers instead. While they were busy performing for their audience, I was quietly compiling the forensic evidence required to secure their federal indictments. Never interrupt a narcissist when they are busy documenting their own crimes. Second, financial and legal literacy provides an impenetrable shield. Love, loyalty, and shared history are abstract concepts easily twisted by greedy relatives. Intellectual property filings, corporate bylaws, and offshore routing numbers are concrete facts. My family believed they could strip me of my power because they viewed me through a lens of societal obligation. They failed to realize I had secured my perimeter using commercial contracts and federal copyright law. You cannot plead your way out of a toxic environment. You must audit your reality, protect your assets, and wield the law as a surgical instrument. Third, sharing genetic material does not constitute a binding debt. Society demands that we honor the concept of blood relation above our own safety. My mother leveraged my childhood conditioning, threatening to disown me if I did not protect a brother who actively stole my life's work. She expected me to absorb her financial ruin to maintain a fabricated image of domestic harmony. I learned that you owe zero loyalty to individuals who utilize the word family as a leash to exploit your labor. True connection is an alliance built on mutual respect, not a syndicate demanding your subjugation. You possess the authority to close the ledger on anyone who drains your resources, regardless of their position on your family tree. If you are currently sitting in a room where your contributions are mocked and your boundaries are ignored, stop seeking their approval. Start securing your exit. Thank you for sharing your time with me today. If my journey provided you with the clarity you needed, or if you are currently gathering your own evidence in silence, leave a comment below. I read every single one. For more narratives about claiming your power and balancing the scales, ensure you subscribe to Hazel Tells Stories. Remember, the quietest person in the room always